Well, here we are in Raleigh, North Carolina, and it's with great pleasure that I'm with my friend and fellow Vietnam veteran, Jerry Rattelade. And Jerry, I can't thank you enough for you coming and spending the time with me today. And we're going to talk a little bit about your life, and we're going to talk about our service in Vietnam. And I think just to start things out, I'm going to start it real easy and ask you, where were you born and raised?
Okay. First, I'd like to say today's date is August 21st, 2019.
Okay.
I was born in Durham, North Carolina, on January 27, 1948. But we immediately, after several months, moved to Raleigh. So I have spent my entire life in Raleigh, North Carolina. My father, Gerard Joseph Rattelade Sr., was born in Canada. He came over to the United States as a young child. My mother, Dolores Pilos Rattelade, came over from Greece during World War II. She and her family got on some of the last remaining boats that were leaving Greece as Germany attacked Greece.
Wow.
She had to leave behind her father and one sister.
Husband.
What?
Her husband and one sister.
My mother had to leave behind her sister and her father.
Yeah.
And she came over with her mother and two brothers to the United States. I have one brother, Harry Rattelade. I have one daughter, Heather Lynn Rattelade, and I have one son, Gerard Joseph Rattelade III.
Where are they located?
One is located in Columbia, South Carolina. One is located in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
Okay. What I want to know is what was it like in your childhood? What was it like growing up?
It was a great childhood. A lot of baseball, basketball, football, a lot of fishing on the small ponds and streams. I had a great childhood.
Where did you go to high school?
I went to Broughton High School in Raleigh.
Okay. And then you graduated from high school.
Right.
Now, as a young man, did you have any, in high school, did you have any ideas that, hey, I want to do this for a career, or were you kind of like I was, where you didn't quite know what you were going to do?
I had no idea what I was going to do.
Did you go to college?
Yes, I went to what it's called now UNC Wilmington, which is on the coast. I went down there for about a year and a half, and my grades were okay. You know, I could have stayed in school. I wasn't making A's and B's, but the money was tight. My dad and mom didn't make a lot of money, so I had a part-time job. I quit college, came back to Raleigh, and went to work at a box factory called Crown Zellerback.
Oh yeah, I'm very familiar with that name. That's a famous Zellerback. That's huge.
And what happened during that time is that my grandfather came to me, and he was from Canada, and said that he didn't feel like he could make the drive himself. Would I help him drive the car and visit his relatives in Canada, because he had never been back to Canada since he left. And by the way, he had been in the Canadian Army. So we went up there and visited the relatives, and my father called me and said, it's in the mailbox, and he read it to me. And I told my grandfather, and he informed the families, and of course all of them wanted me to stay in Canada. They said they could get me a job, I could live with them, but that never occurred to me. My father had fought in World War II, and it was my, you know, it was my turn to do my duty. So came back and I was sworn in Raleigh, North Carolina.
And what date was that? Close to it. What month was that?
The very end of July of 1969.
So when did you have any?
68, July of 68.
Yeah, that would have been July of '68, correct?
Yes.
So did you have any? What was your feeling? I mean, when you got home, you read the letter, and now the reality of it is your life probably is not going to be your own for a while. What were you feeling at that point?
I really didn't, it didn't make a big impression on me. I knew that, you know, it was my turn to serve, and I went along with the program.
Okay. Where did you go to basic training?
I went to basic training at Fort Bragg in Fayetteville, North Carolina.
Okay. And give me a little rundown about that. Was that a culture shock when you got off the bus at the reception station?
Well, it was very tricky the way they did it. We rode down with the drill sergeant on the bus, and he was so polite, very nice, and I thought, wow, this is not bad. And we got down to the base, and they were talking very nicely to us and said, gentlemen, we want you to go in this building, and there would be two bins. On one bin we want you to put any weapons that you have, and in the other one we want you to put any magazines like Playboy magazines or whatever you have.
Drugs.
That's right. And so we sat down, we filled some paperwork, and really at that time everybody was being so polite that I thought, this is not what I thought.
Mm-hmm.
I expected a lot rougher. As I'm walking out of the door, the person in front of me, the door opens up and the drill sergeant kicks him right in the ass. And that's when it started.
Mm. So, do you remember getting your hair cut?
I do. And in fact, that was very unusual, because you go in one side, and then when you have your hair cut, you come out the other side of the building,
Yep.
and you don't recognize the people that you just met.
Exactly. Were there a lot of long hairs when you went?
Plenty.
Yeah. See, being from San Diego, California, I got drafted with a bunch of guys that were from LA. So they were thugs and either thugs or stoners, and a lot of long hairs, right? and these guys, I actually saw guys sitting in the chair crying as the hair was coming off, because that was a symbol. You know, the hair was
Yes.
was like a symbol. So no, I remember that day very, very well. So tell me about basic training. What did you guys learn? What was the routine there?
Really, it was learning formations, marching, a lot of PT, and we needed it, getting everybody in shape, a lot of PT. But basically, discipline, you know, keeping the barracks clean, doing what the sergeant said right when he said it, and it was a learning experience.
Did you have any Gomer piles in your basic training class?
No, I don't remember that.
So you didn't have anybody that stuck out in your mind that just didn't know his right from his left, or?
What I do remember is we did have some real thugs that were from big cities that were fighting the system.
Oh, yes.
and really dangerous. And some of the guys, I felt sorry for some of the guys that were really overweight. They had come in, and the sergeant stayed on them because they couldn't do a pull-up. And I felt sorry for those guys.
I felt sorry for me too. Now, when you were in basic training, I'm assuming you had no idea what your job was going to be or your occupation in the Army was going to be, right?
No.
We didn't find that out until graduation at basic, right? So remember the testing that we went through before, and that would tell the Army what your strengths were and so forth. Do you remember that?
That's kind of blurry.
Okay, well, basically what that was is they figured out who, you'd take a test and then they'd grade it, and then so many guys would leave and so many would stay. Well, the guys that stayed, made a certain level, and it just kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller until the last battery of tests were like, where you listened to code, Morse code, and then you had to do it, and you'd have to receive it and send it, which meant if you're really smart, you could do that. Well, I happened to be a ham radio operator in high school. I got my ham license, so I was very proficient at code, sending and receiving, right? So when this part of the test came up, I thought, man, this is great. And I aced it. I mean, I aced every part of it. And so guess what I thought I was going to be doing after basic training? Electronics, right? Radio. I mean, doesn't that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm.
So did you have any preconceived notions? Did you think you were going to be a truck driver? Or?
I had, John, I was just going along with the ride.
Okay.
I was just going for the ride.
And so were there any rumors going around basic that, hey, the majority of us are going infantry?
I probably did hear something like that.
Yeah, I know when you were I was at Fort Ord, that was an infantry base, training facility. And you went where to basic?
Fort Bragg.
Okay, that was an infantry.
Right.
I mean, so I think our futures were already planned before we even knew it. So at basic, they're reading names, 11B. And I remember the first guy that he did that, the guy goes, "What's that?" And it didn't take very long before almost everybody was 11B. And then that's infantry, of course. And then one or two guys went someplace else. And it was a very sobering experience. And I personally knew there was a mistake, because I knew I was supposed to be going to radio school. So after it was all said and done, I went to the first sergeant and I said, "First Sergeant, there's been a mistake." And he says, "Oh, how's that?" And I said, "Well, I aced all the tests," and I said, "Ham radio operator, and I should be going to radio school." And he got this really sad look on his face. He did. And he was very sympathetic. And he said, "Unfortunately, that just isn't making any difference in this case. And you are 11B, and that's what you're going to go," and so forth. Good news is you're staying right here at Fort Ord. You don't even have to go anyplace else. We're gonna send you to AIT right here, which I did. I stayed there. But that was my introduction to my first major disappointment in the Army. In other words, if I had I actually went through basic thinking I was gonna have a good school, a good radio school, and be very good at what I did and so forth. Well, that all got changed. So you got your orders, 11B, and where were you going to go to base or AIT?
I was when I left Fort Bragg, I flew to Fort Polk, Louisiana, for leadership school. And after leadership school, I stayed at Fort Polk, Louisiana for AIT.
Now, most of us did not do that. So how was it that a basic trainee graduate went to leadership school? I never personally ever heard of that. What was the connection there?
I have no idea. I think
Tell them about the sergeant when you first came in.
the sergeant, I guess the sergeant may have seen some potential for me to be a leader and put me in for leadership school.
So they put you in for it. It
Yes.
wasn't, you didn't volunteer.
No, I didn't know anything about it.
Okay.
So went to AIT for at Fort Polk, and it was there during that training that I had to make a choice between OCS school and NCO school, and I chose to go to NCO school at Fort Benning, Georgia.
Okay, now Polk, was that jungle, was that Tigerland?
Yes.
Was it up and going when you were there?
Oh yes.
Oh, so I mean, a lot of guys don't know what that is. Tell us what Tigerland was all about.
Well, all I can say is, we're going back 50 years now. All I can say is that Fort Polk was a much rougher place than Fort Bragg. It was, I can't describe it. It's just, even though the barracks at Fort Bragg were World War II and the barracks at Fort Polk were World War II barracks, the place was just sort of miserable. I remember the sergeant saying, every morning check your boots because scorpions
Oh,
will climb in your boots and then you'll put your foot in it. So, but it was Fort Polk was a miserable little place.
yeah.
As an
So,
officer, so I.
did you go to sergeant school after AIT?
Yes.
Okay, tell me about sergeant school. Did you stay right there? Did
No.
You, oh, so you went someplace different. Where'd you go?
Fort Polk, you went to Fort Benning, Georgia.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And so went to Fort Benning, Georgia for my
Which,
NCO.
by the way, is the heart of the infantry.
Yes, it is. And so we did a lot of classroom. We did a lot of classroom studies there at Fort Benning, and graduated from Fort Benning, Georgia, as a sergeant. Then I went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and helped train the new troops.
Now, as a platoon sergeant or a DI, I mean,
Not a DI, we just assisted.
So you were
the DI,
okay,
just
okay.
assisted.
cadre.
Yes.
Okay, did you wear the helmet liner, shiny helmet liner?
I don't remember.
It wasn't a Smokey Bear hat.
No, it definitely wasn't.
So it was the shiny helmet liner.
I'm not sure. Can't remember that part.
Yeah. I think that's how they distinguish between the full DI and the guys helping out. So what did you think? Was it going pretty good for you at that point?
At that point, when I left Fort Benning, I knew for sure I was going to Vietnam.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely. So it was going fine. I was just moving, going to the different schools and preparing myself and learning as much as I could because I knew what was ahead of me.
Let me ask you this. I remember basic training was pretty much you had a controlled situation, the DIs, there wasn't a lot of outside people influencing what you were doing. In AIT, when you'd go to instructional classes or you'd go to ranges or that, they had Vietnam vets that were instructors. Did you have that where in Fort Benning or in Fort Polk? Where now the instructors aren't just DIs, but now they're actually Vietnam vets that have come back from the war.
We had that at Fort Polk.
And they were different, weren't they?
Yes.
Tell me your impression of those instructors versus just the regular Army guys.
Some of them were from Vietnam, and they really wanted you to survive. They really wanted you to understand what you were getting into, and they were trying their best to teach you as much as they could so you could survive when you got there. And I took it. I took that seriously.
And it's really interesting that you would say that because the first, I can't remember what it was. It was where we went out in the field in the bleachers. Remember, you'd always get in the bleachers, and it was this short little Vietnam vet guy, and he was limping. It was like his leg was bad. And when he got behind the podium, his head just stuck up over the top. And when he started talking, it was different than anything I'd heard. And he started crying. he was so serious about wanting us to survive. And you said those exact words. The minute I saw a grown man that had come back from Vietnam cry, I knew that my life changed right then and there. And I never, to my knowledge, after that, doped off, screwed around in the bleachers, nodded out, went to sleep. I mean, because I knew this was very, very serious. Did you get that same?
Yes, I knew it was serious.
That same impression?
Yes.
And and I'm very thankful for him, because up to that point, I'm not real sure I was serious. I mean, I kind of thought we're just going through the numbers, right? It wasn't real to me until that day, and then it became real. And I always tell this story. When I came home from Vietnam, I had 6 months to do, and they sent me to Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And lo and behold, what did they have me do? They made me an instructor for AIT.
Great.
I was the Vietnam vet
Yes.
behind the podium. I swear to you, I would get emotional, and I would break down. And the faces in that bleacher, I could see lives being changed, but I couldn't help it. I mean, I was like going, guys, please, I don't want, and I said, I don't want one of you guys to die over there. I just don't want one of you to die. And it changed the whole atmosphere. Full circle.
It sure was.
And so interesting. So you finished the AIT. Tell me about leadership school and specifically sergeant school. Are they teaching you how to read maps? Are they teaching you how to call in artillery? Just tell me some of the, because they didn't teach us how to call in artillery in AIT, obviously.
I think it was an excellent program to take somebody that had been in the Army just a short period of time and to train them how to do all these things. Yes, we're talking about a lot of classroom instruction, calling in artillery, map reading, using the radio, moving formations of men. I can't remember all the things, but you got a report card. So there were at least, I think you graded on at least 8 or 10 units.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't remember what the units are now. But you got a report, actually got a
Yep,
report
yep.
card, how you did on that test. But it including map reading, calling artillery, moving men into combat, and logistics, probably calling in air support, I guess, calling in
Artillery for sure.
artillery. But there were about 8 or 10 components, but I can't remember what they are.
Okay. And did they teach you that you were going to be an E5?
Right.
You were going into Vietnam as a sergeant.
Right.
Did they instill in you the fact that you commanded respect? In other words, when you walked into that platoon for the first time, did you expect that these men were going to look at you and say, now there's a sergeant. We need to follow him.
I think part of the training, as you went through, you just picked that up.
Okay.
It was a subtle message. You picked that up, that you had to be in charge, and that you were responsible for those men's lives.
Yeah. Was it Vietnam oriented? All your training were on topographical maps as opposed to the old, were they using Vietnam maps, for instance, so you'd learn that there's not very many elevations, to go by and that type of thing?
John, I don't remember that. I don't know what kind of maps we used. I can't remember that part, but I don't think we used Vietnam maps.
Okay. Because, and the only reason I say that is because when I was an old guy, and we would receive, we called them shake and bakes, instant NCOs, I was amazed at the lack of knowledge that they had about those types of things, Vietnam ground types of things. And I never questioned it. I mean, I just thought, they were 90-day wonders. And now, the reason I asked about the respect thing is because as a guy that, let's just say I'd been there 6 months, I was an old guy.
Right.
If you lasted 6 months, and you know what I'm saying is
Yes.
true, you were considered to be an old guy. When an instant NCO came in, I had no respect for that man whatsoever. And that's why I asked you, did you go in with one concept of, I'm going to go in and immediately be respected, and did you face something much different? In other words, when you actually went into the platoon, you didn't receive that kind of level of...
I didn't expect it, and I sure didn't get it. I sure didn't get it. I was the new guy,
Yeah.
and I was treated like the new guy.
Yeah.
I mean, you had no value.
And
that's the way I came into the
Well, that
platoon.
was my point. That was my point. And I know the Army had a great, in their heart, they had a great program, and they were trying, because there was so many guys getting killed and wounded. I was an E5, I think, in my 5th month. You know why? Was it because I was super good? Was it because I was super smart? It was attrition. The NCOs were getting killed off and wounded, so they didn't have any.
And experience, John.
Yes, yeah, of course. But I mean, it was attrition.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the Army thought, well, gosh, some of these platoons are being run by E4s. We got to get some NCOs in there. And I don't know if I'm right on that, but I think that's when we saw the increase in number of instant NCOs coming in.
And John, making reference to that, because I went to NCO school, we used to see the guys from OCS school. They were just right across the way. And I always felt sorry, to be honest with you, because I knew what training I had. And they got the same training. I knew when they came in, when the new lieutenant came in, that he knew what I knew, and without experience,
Oh,
that was not a lot.
yeah. And do you agree with me on this? There were 2 kinds of new lieutenants. The smart ones that didn't push people around in the beginning, and they listened a lot, and they asked for help.
Yes.
And then the ones that came in and played John Wayne, and I'm in charge, and you're going to do what I tell you to do.
I agree with that.
Yeah, and that's kind of the story. That was
Yes.
kind of the story of Vietnam. Where did you fly from to go to Vietnam?
I flew out of Raleigh-Durham Airport to...
So you got to come home for a little break.
I'm thinking, John, I can't remember. I'm thinking it was about 3 weeks.
Okay, yep.
Flew out of the Raleigh-Durham Airport, and I remember that very clearly because my dad, who had been in combat in World War II, my mom, they were so sad,
Oh,
so
yes.
upset. It was a very emotional time. Flew to Oakland, went to Travis Air Force Base, left Travis Air Force Base, flew to Honolulu, Hawaii, where we stopped and got out of the plane. They refueled. Then we flew to Wake Island.
Mm-hmm.
Then we flew to Okinawa. And from Okinawa, we flew to Bien Hoa, Vietnam.
And that was the exact route I took. So it's interesting. I forgot Wake. Now that you bring it up, I forgot that one. I remembered the other ones, but I forgot Wake Island. And the reason they were doing that is they were refueling and taking mail.
Yes,
They were dropping off.
yes. I didn't know what they were doing. I was just happy to get off the plane.
Yeah, that was what they were doing there. You land in Bien Hoa. They open the door. Your first impression of Vietnam when you walked out that door?
The humidity and the smell.
What was it?
The humidity was very high. The smell, I don't know where that smell came from, but it did have, it was strong, but I don't know where it came from, where they originated from.
Yep. And when you deplaned, we were at Ben Wa, then did they bus you to Long Bend? Because that's where we ended up, is Long Bend.
I think so.
Yeah, and then you went into a little reception station and waited, basically, for your orders, right?
Right.
So at that point, you had no clue where you were going.
No.
Nothing. You just knew that you were trained, you were ready to go, and now you were waiting anxiously to find out if you were going to be a Screaming Eagle or a Big Red One or whatever. And the last outfit on your mind was the 25th Infantry Division. Probably.
I didn't know where I was going.
Right?
I had no idea.
Yeah, because interestingly enough, Big Red One, 101st, they kind of had that aura of, you know, they were bad guys, you know, they were the tough ones. And the 25th Infantry Division had a unit within them that was the best kept secret in the world. And you know who that was?
The Wolfhounds.
And that's ultimately who you got assigned to.
Yes.
When they said you're going to 25th ID, 2nd and 27th Wolfhounds, you didn't have a clue.
No.
And all you knew is you were going to get on a deuce and a half and go to Coochie.
And you know, John, I don't remember that part. Like, I can't tell you how I got from there to Coochie. I don't know if I went by convoy. I don't know if I went by airplane or if I went by helicopter. That part's gone.
Okay.
I was going to ask, do you remember the airline? Did you fly United, or did you fly in a military plane? Some guys, you know, they. Do you remember?
I believe it was United.
And do you remember the stewardesses? A lot of the guys mentioned that the stewardesses on the way to Vietnam were a lot of older gals. They were a lot of the gals that were older in their careers. Do you happen to remember?
Tim, I don't remember.
Okay.
That part I don't remember.
And there's a backstory to that. In order for a commercial airline pilot or stewardess to take the Vietnam flight,
Volunteer.
total volunteer, they had to sign up for it because
It was dangerous.
it was very dangerous. And the reason he was talking about the older stewardesses is they wanted to give.
Oh, okay.
They wanted to give to the effort. They wanted to serve the men going over. So that's why he brought that up. And yeah, because it was dangerous. And as you know, just from hearing, there were mortar attacks when they were coming in. And in one specific case, just before I got there, a front wheel had been blown out from underneath one of the United Airlines. Nobody got killed or wounded, but I mean, the fact is explosive went off and blew the front wheel off. So it was dangerous. So you get into Coochie. Who was the first person that you met in Coochie from the Wolfhounds? Company clerk, probably?
First Sergeant Farmer.
Oh, okay.
He came out to greet me and he said, "Welcome to Charlie Company, Sergeant." And immediately he turned on me. He said, I was expecting a warm welcome. He said, "Young buck, Sergeant, do you know how long it took me to become a sergeant in this man's army?
Oh,
When I came in this army, we were still using horses." And he just kept right on and then walked me over to my platoon.
and it's true.
And
What he
introduced
was
me.
telling you was true.
Yes. And then he introduced me to the platoon.
And take it from there. Where were you guys at that point?
Shamrock.
Okay.
Shamrock was my first hard spot.
Okay.
It was a very small place that was surrounded by bamboo. And the place was loaded with booby traps. On one particular mission, we walked out of there. We found and destroyed 14 booby traps on one mission.
Why did they have you there? What was the mission? What was the strategic mission of Shamrock?
I have no idea.
Isn't that interesting? No, I'm not being funny about that, but I mean, you went out there, you're assigned to that place, there's booby traps all around you. Are you kind of thinking, why are we here?
At that point, I wasn't doing much thinking. I was in a very steep learning curve,
Yep.
just learning how to survive.
Were you
out there.
scared?
Initially, I wasn't, but once we started finding all these booby traps and I hearing the stories about how many men had been wounded around Shamrock, then I was scared. And in my tour, I'll tell you this, in my tour, I tripped one myself, and it was a hand grenade. It came out, and it had been there so long that the handle had frozen. So I could have been, wounded very early. In my
Early
tour.
on, yeah.
And I stepped over 3 during my tour where bushes were real high, and they had those little wires,
Sure.
sure. Down low. You couldn't
Sure.
see them. And we found later, some of the other men found them and blew them up.
And you just, as luck would have it.
I stepped right over it.
Stepped
Some
right-
other people stepped over it, and someone found it.
Yeah, yeah. And so, who were some of the guys that you remember early on when you went into the platoon? Who are some of the guys that you remember?
The first few weeks, I really only remember, because you were new and you were learning. I believe I only remember 2 people early. That was my lieutenant, Cy Weisner, and Sergeant Chell Franks and Sergeant Willis Estes. I just really didn't know people's names that early.
Mhm. Did they have any nicknames?
Not at that time.
I mean, so these guys were just Sergeant Estes and Sergeant.
Yes.
Okay, okay. I'm assuming that it didn't take you very long to figure out those guys knew what they were doing.
Yes.
And did you try to?
Especially Chell Franks, because Chell Franks had been there 6 months. Had
Oh,
already
yeah.
been there 6 months, so I was really watching him because I needed to learn.
Mhm.
I needed to learn a lot.
Mm-hmm. And so, were you immediately a squad leader when you went in?
No,
Okay, which is true with us too. Most of the time, they didn't
no.
just assign a shake and bake to lead a squad.
In fact, I'll tell you a story that to show you where I was when I first got there. This happened early. We went on an ambush patrol, and someone just walked up to me and said, "You walk last man, and when we stop, I want you to look around with the starlight and see if anyone's following us." That's it. Those were my instructions.
Do you remember who even handed you the starlight?
No, but let me tell you what happened. We left the wire, and it was 15. Back in those days, we took ambush was half the platoon.
Mm-hmm.
We went out. We stopped several times. I looked. Of course, I didn't have a radio, and those are the only instructions I got. Stopped several times. We got to a trail, and when we got to the trail, we stopped. I looked around, and I saw the enemy running across the road. I saw
Oh, wow.
the enemy on the side of the road, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to open up or to not do anything because I didn't have a radio, and no one told me. So about that time, I did not have to make a decision. I mean, this was because the unit started double timing down the trail. We got into the ambush site, just got into it, and the enemy opened up, and it was
Oh, wow.
a wall of steel. And what saved us that night was a heavy team of Cobra. I believe it was 3 Cobras came in, and the way they work, it was brilliant the way they worked. They flew in a circle. One would come in with his minigun and rockets, and as he was vulnerable, starting to go up, the second one would come in behind him. And they did this over and over and over, and finally artillery and mortars came in, and that was, I don't remember too much more about that.
Do you think they did any good? Do you think they were actually getting body count on?
Well, the only thing I remember about that, John, it's a blur. I remember that supposedly a lieutenant colonel in the enemy had been killed. That's all I remember of that incident.
Would you say this was your first major contact?
Yes, it was.
This was your first, now,
That I remember.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about, there's something very blurry in my memory about late July, but that I just can't remember, because I think I got to the field on July 26th.
but you'll never forget that night because of the starlight scope, you were
Yes.
in the rear. I mean, there's just too many
Right.
things that happened.
Right.
Okay, so did the shooting just suddenly stop and the Cobras leave and it's quiet? Did you move your ambush site? Did you stay right there? Do you remember anything about the rest of that night?
No,
Did you guys go out and look for bodies?
I don't remember.
What happened the next morning?
I don't remember that. I just remember someone saying that a lieutenant colonel in the end, a lieutenant colonel for the enemy had been killed. That's all I remember, the whole deal.
You mean the enemy?
Yeah,
Oh, so that was NVA.
yes,
Yeah, it would have been at that time. That would have been the NVA down there.
yes.
That's correct. Yeah, so, okay, so there must have been, they must have got some of them.
Must have, and I don't remember. I mean, it looks like, from past things, it looked like I remember more about that, but I don't.
Do you recall what the emotional tenor was of the group? I mean, the guys. What's it like after a night of fighting for your life like that, and bullets? I mean, obviously bullets were going over your head, and the chaos of the Cobras and the miniguns and the rockets. I mean, was the adrenaline just like hitting you right in the chest?
Oh yes, and mortars were being fired too.
You were getting support.
But some mortars, I believe, from enemy mortars were also coming.
Oh.
It was kind of a quiet. It seems to me that when we went back that day to the wire, everyone was kind of quiet. You know, the smokers were smoking heavy. The other people were quiet. Everybody was quiet.
It's pretty somber.
Yes.
It-
There
it's
wasn't a lot of discussion.
It's very sobering to
Yes.
go through, and your first firefight is unbelievable. You know, it's unbelievable because you can't plan, you can't prepare for that.
No, you cannot.
No.
But I will say that Shamrock, because of Shamrock and because of my experiences with all those booby traps, and because of that night, and because there was also a helicopter shot down outside our perimeter and 7 men were killed, that whole experience, my first experience, was very valuable for me, because after that, I always thought the enemy was there all the time because of that experience.
So you were vigilant. You were
Yes.
hyper vigilant
Yes.
all the time. So how long then were you in that platoon before you took over an actual? Was your first real job a squad leader then? Did you take over a squad or?
At some point, I became squad leader, and it didn't take a long time, but I became a squad leader, but I don't remember when.
And as I recall, they didn't call you Sergeant Rattelade. They gave you a name. What was that?
Sergeant Rock.
Where did that come from? How did they come up with that?
I believe this took place. The best I can come up with is we were at a hard spot, another hard spot later, and I walked by a group of men, and one of the men said something like, "Have you ever read the comic book Sergeant Rock?" And I said, "No, never read it." And another man says, well, you remind me of Sergeant Rock. And
that
from
was-
then on,
and
I was
that-
Sergeant Rock.
And that was it.
That's it.
Yep. It's funny how nicknames, were given. I remember first day I walked into the platoon, the first guy I talked to was Big Joe Wascom. And first thing he said is, "What's your name, new guy?" And I told him. And he said, "Well, what did they call you in the neighborhood?" And I said, "Well, I was always Big John. I was the biggest. There was two Johns. One was Little John and I was Big John." And he goes, "Well, you know what? That's it then. You're Big John." And that was it from day one until the day I left Vietnam.
That's
So it's-
interesting how that happened.
It's funny how nicknames, and we had, in our platoon when I went in, we had our own Rambo, Ed Rambo.
I did see that on the list.
And that's a fact. And so he was another one that took me under his wing. And Ed Rambo, he was really good. Do you recall the very first time one of your guys got killed?
No.
Wounded? Seriously wounded?
I don't remember the incidents. It was almost like, John, sometimes you would be in a company formation, and when you were in a company line, that thing stretched out for
yes.
a long ways, because if you were, say, at least 6 to 10 feet behind the man in front of you, it was like a long snake.
Mm-hmm.
And something would happen up front.
Yep.
Somebody would hit a booby trap. Something would happen. And if you were at the back, it's like you weren't involved.
Well, you got down and waited.
Yeah.
If a medevac came in, most of the time you didn't even know who got on.
No. And
No,
you got the story later. Like
That-
maybe when you went, maybe the next morning, someone said, "Well, so and so was killed." It was like it didn't happen to you.
Yeah. What was one of the closest calls that you had that could have been life or death?
Well, at Shamrock, right away was a booby trap that I tripped. That's for sure. That could have been it right then. I actually tripped it. I mean, my foot caught the wire. The grenade came out. I mean, and that ambush, that could have done it that night.
Mm-hmm. Boy, that was early in your career.
Yes. And I've always been thankful because I got out of there.
Yeah.
I've always been thankful of Shamrock because now it was real. I had seen the enemy running around. Before I'd never seen the enemy.
Well,
I
a
had
lot
seen
of
the
guys had
enemy.
never seen the enemy.
Right.
Guys were there for 3 months and never saw one, unless they were dead. It wasn't like a conventional war. I mean, they didn't just line up and face off with you.
No.
I mean, they were really a slippery, sly. We were up against a good enemy.
Oh, they
very-
John.
a
John, they
very-
were a great infantry. The enemy was a great infantry soldier.
Yeah. Yep.
And like I said, that night when I looked out with that starlight with no instructions and I saw them running across the road and I saw them on the side, it became real.
Mm-hmm. What would you say, if you can remember, what was the worst day that you had in Vietnam?
I want to save that for the end of this
Okay.
discussion.
Okay.
I do want to talk about that.
Okay. And who, as your tour progressed, who became your closest buddies?
Well, you try to not get close to the men, but you do. I became pretty close with Cheryl Franks and Willis Estes and some of the other men, but I don't want to name them because then you leave the other men out. So I want to say
Oh no,
that
I understand.
I did become you try not to, but I did become close with some of the men.
Can't help it.
Yes.
I mean, in battle, it's the guy on your right and the guy on your left.
And you're close. I mean, I've never been that close to somebody for so long. Most of the time you're within a few feet.
Yep,
You eat together.
yep,
You sleep together. You go on missions together. You share food together. If someone sends food in, you share food. So that's you living together with somebody 24 hours a day.
yeah. Yeah, many guys say they were closer to those guys than they were their own families. I mean, if you were there long enough, it was like you were like a family. So did you get some time in the rice paddies?
Oh yes.
Tell me about walking around during the day in rice paddies all day long.
Well, let me say about the rice paddies. I know it's hard to believe, but some of our ambushes at night, we actually slept in a rice paddy full of water the whole night. Because it had these big berms that protected you from the bullets. So if you got to an ambush site and there was no protection, then you would find a place that was safe. And a lot of times it was in a rice paddy full of water, and you slept, well, you spent the whole night in that rice paddy.
How cold did you get when it was probably at night, it was 90 degrees? How cold did you feel when you were in those rice paddies like that?
John, when the temperature changed, for example, when during the monsoon, it could be like, say, 95 that day, and then the temperature when these storms come would drop from, drop 25 degrees real quickly, and your teeth would be chattering.
Soaking wet,
Yes.
and the evaporation
Mm-hmm.
that was coming off of you
Right.
actually caused you to feel like you were freezing to death.
Yes.
Yep.
Yep.
I remember specifically the most discouraging night of my entire tour of Vietnam was we had went out on an ambush patrol, and Lieutenant Krebling had half of us, Sergeant Glover had the other half, and we were going right out in it wasn't rice paddies, but it was vegetation, and our objective was to get to the ambush site. Well, somehow or another we got separated. Krebling went left and Glover went right, and it was so dark you couldn't see in front of your face. And Krebling finally discovered we were separated.
That's very dangerous.
And he was smart. He stopped. Everybody stopped, and we got down. And it started raining. And the water started, in this vegetation started coming up. So you're kneeling or sitting in this water. I took my pot and I put it down and I sat on my pot that was completely underwater.
Right.
I had a poncho, and I was freezing. I mean, you said your teeth were chattering. And all of a sudden, I started crying. And this is what came to my mind. No self-respecting gook would be out in a night like this. What are we doing? There I go again. What in the world am I doing here? That was the most discouraging night I spent in Vietnam. Similar to spending a night in a rice paddy on an ambush patrol, freezing your rear end off, and it was so hot during the day. And then to have that, it was just it bent your mind. It just really got you messed up like that. So I remember those incidences very, very well.
And I'll tell you something else, John, for the families out there, a lot of the men died over there. A lot of the men died very young when they came back.
Yeah.
And for the families, I'll say, their loved ones went through hell in Vietnam.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. And that brings up another subject. We had guys that came into the unit and were with us for a week and got killed. We had guys that, like Sergeant Hanna, that only had a month to go. He'd been there 11 months and got killed. And I was never able to square that up. In other words, it got to a point, and I wasn't the only one, that thought the guy that got killed the first week in Vietnam was the lucky one. He was the, isn't that's reverse thing? I mean, you think you can't think like that. You did. The guy that was there 11 months and got killed, oh man, that was the worst.
That is the worst.
You know, and
To make it all that time.
yeah, and of course, as you know, the longer you're there, you start thinking about the guy that got killed at 11 months, not the guy that got killed a week after he'd gotten there. And then you start wearing that. You start believing that this is very possibly going to be you. Did you ever have that feeling?
I'll tell you, John, I think that each individual soldier had to come up with their own philosophy about Vietnam. After Shamrock and those booby traps, you could either go one of several ways. One, you could be fearful for the rest of your tour and think I'm going to get killed at any moment and live like that, and some of the guys did. Or you could go the way I went, and after that incident, after the feeling helpless about the booby traps, I wanted to be aggressive. I did not want to feel that fear. So I turned it around, and I wanted to be aggressive. So you had to go one way or the other. I just didn't think I could carry that kind of feeling. I'm going to get killed tomorrow. I'm going to get killed the next day. It would make you ineffective.
And that's
So I did not go that route.
That's a great perspective. What you just said is a great way to explain exactly the two choices men had over there. You know, we had new guys come in that were absolutely positive that they were going to get wasted. I mean,
I had some men talk to me and say, I had one man come up and said, Sergeant, I can't go out tonight.
Yes.
I'm going to get killed. And if the guy was a good guy and it was just one time, I'd say, okay, but don't do this too much. I mean, this is a one-time deal, and I would get another guy to go out. But
Yeah.
he had that feeling that he was going to get killed that night.
Yeah. And we had the same thing. I had guys that had that feeling. And like you said, it wasn't necessarily an everyday thing, but that night before going out, something happened. And I was just like you. I always, the first time, respected that, and we just switched the guy out.
Right.
But did you get an R&R while you were there?
Yes,
Where did you go?
Bangkok, Thailand.
Tell me about that.
Well, I really wanted Australia, but I couldn't get it. So there was some kind of rule you had to get out of there in 2 days, or you had to go back to your unit. So I think first day I waited for Australia. I couldn't get it, and so I had to choose, and I chose Bangkok, and I had a wonderful time. I just really I spent a lot of time visiting Bangkok. I saw a lot of beautiful statues and history of Bangkok.
Did you ever make it to the Happy House? Do you recall?
I don't remember.
Well, did you say you spent a lot of money?
I did spend a lot of money.
Oh, I thought maybe a lot of the guys came back from Bangkok and the first thing they mentioned was Happy House. So I just didn't know if you'd...
Was that a house of prostitution?
Well, I think that probably was pretty much. But you don't have to admit to anything here in this interview.
No, I'll admit it. Joanna knows this. My wife knows this.
Big time. Ask them about the 4-packs.
I went out.
4-packs.
I mean, you know, you have to understand. I didn't know when I got back, you know, whether I would lose a leg or be killed,
of course.
or anything. So I was going to live my life right then.
Yeah.
But I went out to the different clubs. Now, a lot of people don't understand it, but if you were in an infantry unit and been in that situation, I had never been to a prostitute in my life, never thought I would ever see a prostitute in my life, but things change. And I went out to clubs at night. I had a taxi driver, and I brought 4 girls home with me every night. And I think I did that, and then the next day the taxi driver would take them home, and then the next night I would take 4 home. Now, let me say this. I was drinking a lot, so I don't remember what happened a lot in that room. So,
Well, you were
But-
a better man than I was.
well,
I'll tell you
I
what.
I don't know what happened. I'm just saying that, you know, that's what I did. It was, you know, and it was fun. I had a good time.
Now, I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to guess that you did not do that in Vietnam.
Do what?
Prostitutes.
Never,
Isn't that interesting?
never.
Why?
Now, first, that's
I
interesting.
mean, I know why. I know why I didn't.
Okay, you tell me.
Because it was either basic or AIT. They had a class specifically on venereal diseases, and they showed a movie, and the movie was called The Horny Swabby,
Oh, come on.
and it was. Listen,
What's the matter?
listen, and this movie, it was a short movie, was about a sailor, and it shows him he was in his civilian clothes, then he's a sailor and he's in his sailor suit, and then it shows him, you know, walking downtown, and then he brings a prostitute back to the room, and then there's a little interlude there, and then it shows him in the shower. And the narrator said, there are some things in life that you just can't wash off. Okay? Now, that in and of itself did not convince me that I should not be with a prostitute in Vietnam. What did is afterwards, and the instructor got up and said, I'm going to start listing the venereal diseases in Vietnam. And he started in, and he goes, and then there's the last one, and we call it Brand X. Brand X is a venereal disease that we have not gotten a cure for yet. Now, the problem with Brand X, he said, is if you get it, they're not going to let you come home because they don't have a cure for it. There's no way they're going to let you come back to the United States and spread it. And he said, instead, what they do with those guys is there's an island someplace, and the Army has a facility there, and they send those guys there trying to figure out how to cure it. And if they never do, they just put them as MIA. Now, I was pretty naive, probably, but I believed it. I believed every single word of it. So when I went to Vietnam, and I was in the field, and a lot of my buddies, hey, we'd walk through the villages, boom boom girls come out. Doc Turner, I'll never forget it, he'd say, fellas, I'll take them in here, I'll check them out, I'll make sure they're okay. And the funny thing was, and I was just talking to Doc about this, he was in there like for 20 minutes. You know, I never could, you know, and then he'd come out and he'd say, yeah, it's okay. And then whoever, you know, wanted to. But I always, in the back of my mind, thought, I can't. And I knew guys that got the clap over there. And the first thing they do is go to Doc Turner, and he had a syringe with a needle on it about like that. And it was the old penicillin shot, and most of those guys never learned their lesson. They had more than a couple penicillin shots. So, but something happened when you went on R&R. It wasn't Vietnam. It was, you know, it was a different situation, and somehow or another the word got out that the women in Bangkok or Hong Kong or whatever were required to have health cards, and I mean it was a regulated industry. So that made it different. In other words, you weren't thinking Brand X at that point.
No, John, it was exactly, I was thinking as you were talking, when we got there, they gave us about a 30-minute orientation in Bangkok, and they said, we want you to stay at these clubs, and we want you to not go here. These women have been checked, and they're okay.
They had health cards.
Yes, they wore them.
Yeah.
And it was disguised. It wasn't like girls walking the street. You would go to a nice club, they would have music, and there would be, 50 girls dancing, a few drinks, and then I would go to club, and I might pick up one woman here, and then woman there, but they were all dressed nice.
Oh, yes.
They were polite. It was a whole different. It was a whole different situation.
And that's the same way it was at most R&R sites. I think Hong Kong was the same way, and basically that was how it went. But you mentioned something, the attitude of, you know what, I might as well experience life now, because when I go back,
and
I
think
at least,
of all the men, John, that you serve with,
I know.
never had a chance to enjoy their life.
I know.
When you went, do you remember how much money you took?
Tim, I don't.
Because as a sergeant, you probably made pretty good money. Did you hold any of it back and put it in a savings account?
Yeah, I had some that was automatically taken out.
Most of us did.
Yeah.
Most of us had it sent.
Yes, most of it came out.
Yeah, but we talked to a couple different guys, and they didn't do their finances very well. And so, we knew one guy that went to Australia, and he had enough money for a hotel room and a 2-pound thick piece of salami, and that's what lasted him 7 days.
Oh, God.
That was it. So.
And that's on his interview, by the way. After this, I'll tell you who it is, and you can watch it. It's actually pretty funny. Yeah, and they used to make you show that you had so much money. I mean, you couldn't just go to Bangkok or Hong Kong and be broke. They didn't want a bunch of GIs over there sitting on park benches, right?
But you know what? Since you brought up the subject, it really shocked me that I was willing to do that, and that I had crossed over, had changed my attitude.
Yes.
For me, I never thought that I'd go to a prostitute in my life, but there was something so dark on the other side. And it was dark up ahead too. The possibilities that I stepped over that line.
Mm-hmm. Now, what was it like going back from R&R? I mean, you had a little mental rest, a little diversion. Now you have to go back.
John, to be honest, it was just a matter of fact. I'm going back. Prepare yourself mentally for that.
Yep.
And I just went back. I didn't have any idea. It was just, my R&R was over, and it was time to go back, to be with the men and to fight the war.
Mm-hmm.
And what was it like for you?
My story is a little bit different, because I actually had 2 R&Rs. Because I was there and outlasted, Ray and I were there the whole 12 months. And we were the only 2 out of, I don't know how many that lasted, the 12 months. So I got an R&R like at 6 months. And then another one came up when we were there. Ray and I both got 2 R&Rs. One of them came up about 9 months. But they weren't used to handing those out because nobody lasted 9 months. So it was an unusual thing. And they actually asked Ray and I, do you guys want to go on another R&R? Or do you want to stay out here? Yeah, okay. And that second R&R is when I told my dad, I said, I want you to send me so much money, because I'm going to go to that Navy ship store in Hong Kong, and I'm going to buy stereo equipment, and I'm going to buy a camera, and you could buy, I got a Canon 35 with the big lens and all that stuff, and it was cheap. I mean, it was like really cheap, and they'd ship it home for free. And so that second trip was more of a I'm going to go buy stuff, type of thing. And but there was still time to go out to parties and stuff like that too. But that was my second R&R. After Diamond, I I was not in a good spot, and I was sitting there, and I decided that I wasn't gonna go back. I made a conscious decision, and of course, it was a 7-day R&R. So I decided I wasn't gonna go back, and I didn't. And so day 8, day 9, day 10, 11, 12. And then I'm starting to think, I don't have any money left. But how am I gonna get out? I only have a one-way ticket, airline ticket to Vietnam. How am I gonna get out of here? How would I get home anyway? Now that just goes to show you how disturbed a person can be
Mm-hmm.
mentally.
Yes.
I'm admitting it. You're not thinking straight. So on the 14th day, I got back on the plane. I mean, where else? There was nowhere else to go. Now, on the plane ride back, it suddenly occurred to me that I'd been AWOL for 7 days. And it suddenly occurred to me that the consequences of being AWOL was court-martial or long ban. I mean, that's serious. AWOL was not, AWOL was bad. They didn't tolerate that. And so now I'm going to get back there. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to lose everything I've got to this point, and I'm going to wind up in Long Bend. So I was convinced that was it. And I was very sick at heart about that. So got back to Cu Chi. I'm walking towards the Quonset hut, the company area, waiting for the MPs to come and cuff me and so forth. And the company clerk came walking out. He was going over to the supply room, and he looked up and he saw me walking towards the deal. And he looked at me and he goes, "Quintrell, you son of a..." And he just started cussing and carrying on. And I go, "What?" And he came up to me and he goes, "You know what? I could have wound up in jail over you." And I said, "What are you talking about? I'm the one that's going to wind up in jail." He goes, "No, I put you back on the morning report the day that you were supposed to be back here." And he said, "Every day that you weren't here, I was lying." He lied every single, and he says, and every once in a while they check those they were checking them. He goes, I could have been sent to Long Bend over you. And I said, "You'll never know, I owe you." I said, because I thought I was going to Long Bend. But that was, again,
He did you a big favor, John.
well, you know what? We looked out for each other.
Yeah.
Honestly, even, like the supply guys and that, they'd get us stuff when we needed it. But that was huge. Because to be honest with you, I was AWOL. How could I explain that? So that's my story.
That's a big break.
So, were you wounded in Vietnam?
No.
Okay. And did you receive any awards?
CIB, which is the most important one to me,
Mhm.
Air Medals, and Bronze Star.
Mhm. Which are all...
And some other medals, but I can't remember.
Oh, I know, yeah.
Uh,
The unit citations and all that kind of good stuff. Tell me what it was like when you were there about 9-10 months. What was going on in the platoon? You'd been there for this amount of time. You'd seen guys come and go. Too many. You'd seen too many guys come and go. I want to know what your life was like towards the end there.
Well, I think I'll pick that up in my last part about that time. But by then I had gotten really good at my job, and that was important. I had gotten really good. I had bonded with my men. I knew how to run patrols. And I'd gotten used to the everyday problems that existed. Like some men, I mean, I don't know why they came up to me. I'm 21 years old, and they would come to me and say, "Sergeant, let me show you this," and get a Dear John letter.
Oh, yes.
And I remember how depressed these men were. There they were.
Devastated.
They were in Vietnam. They couldn't do anything about it. Their wife was at home, and she sent him a letter that she's dating another man.
Why was it always his best friend? 9 out of 10 times. Why was it always the best friend?
I don't know, but it was so hard to deal with that because I'm 21. I'm not a psychologist.
Yes, yes.
They're asking me my opinion on that, and I did the best I could.
I had guys ask me to write letters for them because they couldn't do it. They couldn't formulate, and they wanted me to write the letter of pleading and begging, and I mean that was bad. And I wasn't even 21. I was 19.
And also, I remember some guys, some black soldiers coming up to me, and things were bad back in the States, and they'd show me a letter and they said, my friend is in college, Sergeant, and he says, why should the black man
Oh yeah.
be fighting for you white men over here? And I looked at him, and I remember telling him, I said, listen, just remember this. He's at home, safe. You're over here. I said, I want you to keep your head in the game.
Mm-hmm.
I said, and be part of this team, because if we work as a team, we'll get home alive.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't, then some of us are going to die.
Mm-hmm.
So just please listen to me on that. Don't pay attention to that letter.
Yeah. And my whole tour over there, we had very similar situations where it started to get to the point where there were, guys were segregating themselves away from other guys and so forth. And it took, you've said it so well, it took the team aspect out of the picture. And the minute that happened, that whole unit broke down. In other words, instead of having 14 guys to go out on that ambush patrol, now we had 10. We had less ammo, we had one less machine. I mean, think about it. You were there. I mean, think about what 2 or 3 or 4 guys meant.
A lot.
And so that was pretty common, actually. So that was something we had to deal with. They always used to tell us, if you last 10 months, we're going to get you offline, we're going to get you a job in the back, you'll have served your time in that. Did they do that when you got towards the end of your tour?
Yes.
And did you get to benefit from that?
Yes, and I'm going to cover that in the last part.
Okay.
Exactly how I was affected by that too.
Okay. There's a famous battle that went on called the Renegade Woods.
That I'm going to talk about at the end. I'm going to conclude with that.
But because that's, each one of us when we were over there had a hallmark moment, had a marker that marked our tour, and it was usually a very horrible thing. Usually it just is a horrible thing, and that's why I know I want you to share.
I definitely will.
Some of that. So all in all, you did 12 months in Vietnam.
Yes.
You did the whole.
No, but I didn't spend the whole 12 months in the field.
No, I know, but you did a whole tour.
Yes.
You were there for the entire 12 months.
Yes.
Okay. Now, usually what I do is I'll ask you when you came home, what did you pursue? Did you have a sweetheart? Did you get a job? Did you have a career? Did you get married? I like to go into that. So is that premature to what you
Yeah.
want to do?
Yeah, John, I just wondering if you don't mind, for all the families, I know you told me because people will find this website.
Oh, yes.
And I'd like to, if you don't mind, I'd like to read the men that I served with in Vietnam.
You know what? This is your interview.
Okay.
This
So
is
that the families that will never get to hear the story will hear their names.
yes.
Sergeant Willis Estes, Charles Cooney, Mickey Griffith, Sergeant Harold Dunlap, Bruce Hotchkiss Jr., Robert Howell, William Ivory, Sergeant Samuel Pra, John E. Rarick, George W. Reinwald, Ronald Smith, Dale Berg, Sergeant Lloyd Yost, Jim Bergman, Jacob Hauer, Ernest Jones, Terry Lane, Patrick McCarthy, John Parrott, First Sergeant John Farmer, Robert Romer, Severiano Rios, Michael Schaefer, George Weldon, Robert Wood, Ricardo Zamora, Jerry White, Nelson Fox, Paul Barker, Ronnie Dawley, Mark Ladd, Joseph Leibel, Melvin Kalele, Sergeant Chell Franks, John DePra, Jerry Tempesta. And I had 3 platoon leaders while I was in Vietnam. Cy Weisner, Lieutenant Cy Weisner, Lieutenant Thomas Davis, Lieutenant Ronnie Clark. Lieutenant Thomas Davis was killed in Vietnam. Lieutenant Ronnie Clark was seriously wounded. I had 6 company commanders while I was in Vietnam. 1 was killed, 4 were wounded, and 1 made it out of the field. My battalion commander for part of my tour was Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer.
You know, not to interrupt your reading, some of those guys that you just listed got killed in Vietnam. And their families, and I'm going to bring this up, we have reunions. And that's a chance for us to get together and be with the guys that we served with. Tell me your impression. What was the first reunion that you went to? What did you feel like at that reunion? What was that like for you?
That reunion was very powerful. That's the first time that I had seen some of the men that I had served with, I don't know, probably in 40 years. And you and Tim and Laura did a fabulous job of putting that reunion together. It was very powerful, very emotional. When you come to your first reunion, when you leave, you have had a very powerful experience, and you come home and it takes a while.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it takes a while to sink in.
And you know, one of the things I think that I wasn't prepared for when I started this whole project was the effect that it could have or did have on family
Yes.
members. And I'll never forget the Rarick family at the reunion, and how many showed up. I mean, we thought maybe there was going to be 3 or 4.
Yes, I was told that.
How many were on that stage? Do you remember that?
Yes, I think you said 32 or 33.
Exactly. It was unbelievable.
I remember Tim saying, "Wow!" I heard that across the thing. Wow.
Yeah. And so, you know, reunions have really offered you know, not only for the guys, but for the wives, that for some of these wives for 35 years never could figure out why their husbands were like they were.
Yes.
Because they never heard.
Yes.
They never talked about it. And then, of course, the children and the adult children and the you know, so.
Oh, I think it was a great experience. I think it was what you provided, a situation where people could hear the stories.
Yeah, but you reading these names and the generations to come,
Yes.
they're gonna Google somebody's name.
Yes.
You know, and they're gonna run into this.
Yes.
And the feeling they're gonna get is, gosh, my dad, my brother, my son wasn't forgotten. They meant something. Their service meant something. And you've just brought that to right now. You've just brought that.
And like you said, John, a lot of these men were killed. A lot of these men were seriously wounded. And when I started my process of trying to locate the men to bring them to your reunion, I found that a lot of these men, at least 6, died in their 50s.
Mm-hmm.
So Vietnam had a tremendous
Oh.
impact on their lives.
Oh, yes.
So John asked me about the end of my tour, and I'd like to talk about that. On March 30th, 1970, Charlie Company came in for a 2-day stand down. That's where the company comes back to division headquarters, which was at Cu Chi. And we got to do this about every 3 or 4 months. It was a chance for the men to rest, take showers, drink beer, buy some supplies at the PX. On April the 1st, I was with my platoon preparing to go back out to the field. The clerk came out to me and said, "Sergeant Rattelade, you have a job offline. You will not be going back to the field." I didn't believe it, and I told him I didn't believe it. He walked away. About 15 minutes later, the first sergeant from the company came out and said, "Sergeant Rattelade, you have a job offline. Take your weapons and your hand grenades and everything and turn them in." To an infantry soldier, what that meant was that I was going to live and I was going to have a chance to go back to my family. But I was conflicted because I had grown close to some of my men, and now I had to tell them that I wouldn't be going back out with them. And I shook hands and I talked to the men and told them I wouldn't be going out with them, and some of them were very concerned about me not going back out. And I told them everything will be fine, everything will be okay. I went to see the new sergeant that was taking my place. His name was Melvin Kalele. He was his second tour. And he asked me some questions about the platoon, and I gave him some information. And then they packed up and left. That was April 1st. April 2nd, 1st Platoon, which was my platoon, was the lead platoon for the company. They walked into an L-shaped ambush, and the results were tragic. 12 men were killed, and 17 men were wounded. Sergeant Willis Estes and myself were chosen to identify the men. We were flown by helicopter up to the top of a mountain named Nui Ba Dien. There we entered a large Connex box, and in that Connex box were about 18 dead soldiers. It was dark. We had to use flashlights, and we went from man to man, making sure that we made positive identification. We got back on the helicopter. Let me say one more thing. Some of those men in there had been hit. They had bullet holes, some of them dozens and dozens and dozens. We got back on the helicopter and we're flying back to Cu Chi. And I remember thinking, I told those men that everything would be fine and everything would be okay. And I can tell you, I have felt guilty about not being there at the Renegade Woods. And I'll probably carry that until the day I die. Now, John, in past interviews, has talked about heroes. And I will say that Charlie Company had lots of men that were extremely courageous. But the two heroes I want to talk about today are my dad, Gerard Joseph Rattelade Sr. He was an E7 sergeant in the infantry unit in World War II, and he fought at the Battle of the Bulge. My dad also wrote me 368 letters while I was in Vietnam. I was lucky to have a dad like that. My second hero is my wife, Joanna Riley Rattelade. Joanna was a nurse in the Air Force for 25 years. She was at Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines during Tet of 1968 and the mini Tet of 1969. They had thousands of seriously wounded soldiers come through that hospital, and Joanna took care of them. Joanna volunteered for Vietnam and was sent to Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam in 1970. And there she took care of the wounded soldiers. Joanna is in the room at this time during this interview, and I'm glad she's here. And I want to say to her, you are an inspiration to me. And you have been it. You have been the wind beneath my wings. I love you. And I want to thank Big John, Laura, and Tim for putting together the reunions and for doing these interviews. It's taken a lot of effort. Thank you very much.
My privilege.
And to the men that I served with, I want to say it was an honor and a privilege to have served with you.
Is there anything else we need to cover before we finish?
That's it, John.
Well, I can't thank you enough. And thank you for always being there for your men. And thank you for, ever since I've met you, you've always been here for me.
Thank you, John.